Missouri or near Kansas City, go to a fight show, and we'll probably be selling hillbilly fight wear. We got different little slogans.
Country music has given the world voices that will never be forgotten. Songs that carried laughter, tears, and the heartbeat of ordinary people. But behind the spotlight and the applause lies a darker truth. Some of these beloved stars, once draped in rhinestones and riding in Cadillacs, would die in loneliness, debt, and despair. The wealth, the crowds, the fame, all of it proved fragile. Their stories remind us that success can vanish overnight, and that the same stage that crowns legends can also leave them forgotten. From Faron Young, the hillbilly heartthrob who seemed untouchable, to Jimmy Capps, the quiet guitarist whose name history nearly erased, these are the tales of country legends who lost it all. How could icons who defined an entire genre fall so far? And what lessons remain for today's artists standing under the same bright lights? The answers lie in heartbreak, betrayal, and the cruel cost of fame. Faron Young was once the very definition of a country superstar. Born in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1932, he earned the nickname the Hillbilly Heartthrob, not just for his youthful good looks, but for a voice that could smooth over heartbreak or light up a dance hall. By 1952, after signing with Capitol Records, Young had left behind a humble upbringing and found himself standing among Nashville's brightest stars. His first hit, Going Steady, launched him into the national spotlight, and soon the Grand Ole Opry welcomed him as a fixture. Audiences adored him for his smooth blend of honky-tonk grit and polished charm, a combination that made him radio gold. But Faron Young was never just a singer. He had a sharp business mind, a rare quality in the entertainment industry. In the 1960s, he launched Music City News, a magazine that spotlighted Nashville's rising talent and gave country music its own print platform. He also made wise investments in real estate, which, at least for a time, gave the impression that his fortune would last forever. He was admired not only for his music, but for supporting younger artists, earning him a reputation as both mentor and mogul. By mid-career, he looked untouchable. Chart-topping hits, business ventures, and the kind of stability most stars could only dream of. But country music, like all music, changes with the times. By the 1970s, the fresh sounds of outlaw country and the glossy polish of newer Nashville acts began pushing traditional voices aside. Radio programmers labeled Faron Young's style yesterday's sound. His songs, once essential listening, were fading from the playlists that kept artists alive. The empire he built suddenly seemed fragile. In a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Young sold his publishing catalog for a fraction of what it was worth. That one mistake cut off what should have been a lifetime stream of royalties, income that could have secured his future even as his performance schedule slowed. As debts mounted, the man once seen as a titan of Nashville was left scrambling. Financial pressures weighed heavily on him, but so did something far darker: the loneliness of fading relevance. For a performer who once thrived in the center of attention, the silence was deafening. By the 1990s, the music industry that Faron Young had helped build barely had room for him. He performed occasionally, but behind the scenes his health faltered and depression took hold. On December 9, 1996, in his Nashville home, the man once celebrated as a heartthrob and a hitmaker took his own life. He was 64 years old. The tragedy of Faron Young is not just in his death. It's in the irony that a man who invested so wisely, who mentored others, and who once seemed immune to hardship could lose everything. His story stands as a haunting reminder that even the brightest stars can burn out, not from lack of talent, but from an industry that forgets its pioneers. Lefty Frizzell was more than just another singer in the golden age of country music. He was a revolutionary. Born William Orville Frizzell in 1928 in Corsicana, Texas, he brought to the stage a style of phrasing and delivery that would shape generations to come. His ability to bend words, linger on syllables, and sing with conversational intimacy created a sound so unique that artists like Merle Haggard, George Jones, and Willie Nelson all credited him as their greatest influence. In 1950, his breakout year, he released back-to-back hits that changed everything. If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time, and I Love You 1,000 Ways. Practically overnight, the young Texan was transformed into a national star. By his mid-20s, Lefty was one of Nashville's most bankable names. He wore flashy suits, drove Cadillacs, and lived the life of a country celebrity at a time when country stars were rarely treated like royalty. His future seemed untouchable. But beneath the success, the foundations of his career were already beginning to crack. Exploitative contracts with record labels and poor business management meant that even as his records sold in the millions, he saw only a small fraction of the profits. The money that should have secured him for life was funneled elsewhere, and the pressures of fame combined with financial instability began to weigh heavily on him. As the stress grew, Lefty turned more and more to alcohol, a decision that would erode not only his health, but also his reputation as a reliable performer. While his voice remained one of the most captivating in the business, his reliability became a concern. Missed shows, erratic behavior, and increasing dependence on alcohol drove promoters and record companies to distance themselves. To make matters worse, in an attempt to cover tax debts and the absence of steady royalties, he sold off his publishing rights. That single decision robbed him of the lifeline that could have carried him through the lean years ahead. By the 1970s, Lefty Frizzell's decline was stark and heartbreaking. Once celebrated as a superstar, he was reduced to pawning personal belongings just to get by, including a prized diamond-studded guitar that had once symbolized his success. He lived in a modest rented apartment, far from the glamorous lifestyle he had once enjoyed. His health was crumbling, the years of heavy drinking leaving him with severe liver damage. On July 19, 1975, Lefty Frizzell died at just 47 years old. His funeral expenses had to be covered by friends, a tragic symbol of how far he had fallen. Yet, even as he was laid to rest, his influence was undeniable. Nearly every great country singer who followed carried echoes of Lefty's style in their voices. His phrasing, his timing, his raw emotional delivery, it all lived on in their songs, even as his own life ended in poverty and obscurity. Lefty Frizzell's story is one of immense brilliance shadowed by exploitation, addiction, and financial ruin. He changed the sound of country music forever, but he could not escape the cruel reality of an industry that rewarded his genius with glory in the moment, but no security in the end. Johnny Paycheck was the very embodiment of the outlaw spirit in country music. Born Donald Eugene Lytle in 1938 in Greenfield, Ohio, he reinvented himself as Johnny Paycheck, a name that would soon be tied to one of the most defiant anthems ever recorded. With his gritty voice and rebellious image, he fit perfectly into the outlaw country movement of the 1970s, performing alongside legends like Waylon Jennings, Merle Haggard, Willie Nelson, and Hank Williams Jr. In 1977, his career reached its defining moment with the release of Take This Job and Shove It. The song became an instant working-class rallying cry, a defiant anthem for millions of people who dreamed of telling their bosses exactly where to go. Practically overnight, Johnny Paycheck became a household name. For a brief period, he stood shoulder to shoulder with the giants of country music. But behind the stage lights and the string of hits, Paycheck lived a life of turbulence. His outlaw persona wasn't just an act, it was who he was. Financial mismanagement, reckless spending, and a dangerous addiction to drugs and alcohol ate through the millions he earned. Despite sold-out shows and royalties pouring in, the money vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. Cocaine binges, legal battles, and high-powered attorneys drained his accounts. Paycheck seemed determined to live faster than the fortune he had built could keep up with. By the early 1980s, his personal troubles were overshadowing his music. In 1985, during a barroom altercation, he pulled a gun and shot a man in the head. Though the victim survived, Paycheck was convicted and sentenced to prison. For an artist who had once been on top of the world, the downfall was staggering. The prison years solidified his outlaw reputation, but destroyed what remained of his financial stability. When he was finally released, he returned to a life stripped bare. The IRS had seized nearly everything he owned: his home, his tour bus, even his Grammy Awards. The very trophies that symbolized his success were taken away, sold off to cover debts. Once a chart-topping star, Johnny Paycheck was reduced to asking for money at gas stations and relying on the kindness of fans and friends to survive. His health, already battered by years of excess, began to collapse. Emphysema and asthma robbed him of his ability to perform with the power that had once defined him. Each appearance became harder, each breath a struggle. By the time he died in 2003, at the age of 64, he was nearly penniless, a shadow of the man who had once roared defiance into the microphone. The tragedy of Johnny Paycheck is found not just in his reckless choices, but in the cruel irony that his biggest hit, "Take This Job and Shove It," cemented his immortality, even as he lived out his final years broke and forgotten. He had given the working class their anthem, but he himself could not escape the grind of debt, addiction, and decline. Paycheck's story is a warning. Fame without control can vanish overnight, leaving nothing but a name, a song, and the bitter taste of what could have been. Hank Locklin was a cornerstone of classic country, a voice so smooth and heartfelt that it carried across oceans. Born in Florida in 1918, he rose from humble beginnings to become an international sensation with timeless ballads like "Send Me the Pillow, You Dream On," and "Please Help Me, I'm Falling." His ability to wrap emotion in simple lyrics made him a favorite not only in America, but in Europe and Asia, where he toured extensively and built a devoted fan base. At his peak, Locklin stood as one of the most recognizable names in country music. Yet despite the fame and the applause, his financial life told a different story. Contracts signed early in his career were tilted heavily in favor of record labels, leaving him with modest royalties that never reflected the millions who loved his songs. As the 1960s ushered in the British invasion and shifting tastes, his bookings dwindled. A series of business missteps and even fraudulent dealings left him saddled with debts he hadn't created. Though he remained beloved at the Grand Ole Opry, the fortune that should have been his never materialized. He lived out his later years quietly in Brewton, Alabama, passing away in 2009 at the age of 91, leaving behind a legacy of music, but little in financial security. If Locklin's tragedy was in contracts and neglect, David Stringbean A. Keeman's was far darker. Stringbean was more than a banjo player. He was a full entertainer, lanky and comical with a stage costume that exaggerated his frame, and a wit that made audiences roar with laughter. A member of Bill Monroe's band in the 1940s, and later a beloved star on the Grand Ole Opry and television's Hee Haw, He embodied the spirit of old-time country, blending comedy with banjo picking in a way no one else could. But behind the humor was a man scarred by the Great Depression. Distrustful of banks, Stringbean lived modestly and stashed away his earnings in cash hidden behind chimney bricks and under the floorboards of his cabin. To the outside world, he appeared almost frugal to a fault, never flaunting his success. That caution, however, made him a target. On November 10, 1973, after a night performing at the Opry, Stringbean and his wife Estelle returned home to find intruders waiting. Robbers, convinced he kept money hidden on the property, ambushed the couple. In a shocking act of violence, both were murdered on their front porch. Nashville was shaken to its core. Years later, when new owners moved into the Ackerman cabin, they found bundles of cash rotting in the walls, eaten away by time and mold, a tragic confirmation of the rumors. Stringbean had died with his savings literally disintegrating inches from where he had lived, unable to protect him from the cruelty of the world outside. Together, the stories of Hank Lachlan and Stringbean Ackerman reveal two faces of the same truth: that country music's greatest gifts were too often betrayed by an industry, by circumstance, or by fear. Lachlan gave the world ballads of love and longing, yet earned little from them. Stringbean gave laughter and tradition, yet lost everything to violence. Their lives remind us that fame offers no shield against poverty, tragedy, or betrayal, and that even legends can be left with nothing but memories, rotting cash, and songs that outlived the men who sang them. Blaze Foley was one of country music's most unconventional figures, a songwriter whose life was as raw and unpolished as the songs he wrote. Born Michael David Fuller in Arkansas and raised in Texas, he began singing gospel with his family before striking out on his own. He quickly built a reputation as the duct tape messiah, decorating his clothes, boots, and even guitar cases with strips of silver tape. To some, it looked like a gimmick, but for Blaze, it was a symbol of his individuality and the scrappy resilience that defined his life. His songs carried that same honesty, ballads filled with simple truths and poetic grit. Tracks like "If I Could Only Fly" captured heartbreak and longing in ways that resonated deeply with fellow musicians, even if mainstream audiences never embraced him. Yet for all his artistry, Blaze lived in constant poverty, playing small bars and living hand to mouth, often relying on the kindness of friends for a couch or a meal. Then, in February 1989, tragedy struck. Foley was shot and killed while defending a friend during a drunken dispute. He was just 39 years old. When paramedics arrived, they found only $30 in his pocket and an uncashed check among his belongings. The man who wrote songs of haunting beauty died with nothing but loose change in his hands. In death, however, his reputation grew. Willie Nelson, Merle Haggard, and John Prine all covered his songs, bringing them to wider audiences who never knew him when he was alive. His legacy, born of poverty, only flourished after it was too late. Townes Van Zandt lived a parallel tragedy of genius wasted by struggle. Born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1944 into a wealthy oil family, he turned away from privilege to chase the life of a wandering songwriter. His words were unmatched, poetic, mournful, and filled with a melancholy that cut straight to the soul. Songs like Pancho and Lefty, If I Needed You, and Waiting Around to Die made him a legend among his peers. Yet, Townes himself lived like a ghost, drifting from bar to bar, motel to motel, rarely anchored to one place. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder at a young age, he underwent brutal insulin shock therapy that damaged his memory and focus, scars that never left him. Alcohol became his constant companion, eroding his health and his relationships. Financially, he was as unstable as his lifestyle. Royalties, when they came, slipped through his fingers, sometimes given away to strangers, sometimes wasted recklessly. Friends tried to save him, to ground him, but his restless spirit refused stability. While contemporaries built empires, Townes lived on couches, in run-down apartments, or out of the back of his van. To the mainstream, he was nearly invisible, but to songwriters, he was untouchable. A genius whose art was undeniable even if his life was a disaster. On New Year's Day, 1997, at the age of 52, Townes Van Zant's body finally gave out. Years of drinking had ravaged his health, and he died of cardiac arrhythmia in a small house, surrounded not by wealth or security, but by the chaos he had always carried. At his death, he owned little and left behind few possessions of value, though his songs would go on to earn fortunes for others. Together, Blaze Foley and Townes Van Zant paint a devastating portrait of country's tortured poets, men whose music elevated the genre into realms of poetry and pain, but whose own lives remained anchored in poverty, addiction, and instability. They were celebrated as geniuses only after they were gone, their stories proving that artistry is not always rewarded, and that sometimes the world waits until death to recognize brilliance. Jim Reeves, known to millions as Gentleman Jim, was one of the most influential voices in the history of country music. Born in 1923 in Texas, his rich baritone and smooth delivery helped shape the Nashville sound, a polished blend of country and pop that pushed the genre far beyond its traditional borders. With songs like Mexican Joe, Adios Amigo, Welcome to My World, and Am I Losing You, Reeves captured audiences not only in America, but around the world. By the early 1960s, he was selling out shows on multiple continents. One of the first country singers to become an international icon. His velvety voice and gentlemanly charm made him appear untouchable, a man who had not only conquered Nashville, but rewritten what country music could be. Yet the polished image masked financial fragility. Reeves, like many artists of his era, placed enormous trust in managers and signed contracts that favored record companies far more than himself. While his music brought in millions, much of that revenue slipped through his hands. Then, on July 31, 1964, tragedy struck. Piloting his own private plane near Nashville, Reeves encountered stormy weather. The plane went down, killing him instantly at just 40 years old. For fans, it was the end of an era. For his widow, Mary Reeves, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Instead of inheriting financial security, she was left with a tangled mess of contracts, debts, and fraud. For decades, she fought in court to reclaim the royalties that should have been hers, mortgaging homes, paying endless legal fees, and living in financial distress even as Jim's records continued to sell worldwide. Though she achieved some victories late in life, they came far too late to erase the years of hardship. Graham Parsons' story, though very different, carried the same thread of wasted fortune and tragic downfall. Born in 1946 into a wealthy Florida citrus family, Parsons inherited a substantial fortune at a young age. But privilege became a curse. Drawn to music, he abandoned wealth and safety for the chaos of the road. He became a pioneer of what he called cosmic American music, a visionary blend of country, rock, folk, and gospel that would influence generations of artists to come. With the Byrds, he helped shape their groundbreaking album Sweetheart of the Rodeo, bringing country to rock audiences in a way that had never been done before. With the Flying Burrito Brothers, he laid the foundation for country rock, his songwriting and stage presence pushing boundaries that Nashville resisted. Later, As a solo artist, he partnered with an unknown singer named Emmylou Harris, mentoring her and creating some of the most haunting duets in country history. Yet, for all his genius, Parsons was consumed by drugs, alcohol, and reckless spending. The inheritance that could have sustained him for life evaporated in a few short years. By the time the Burrito Brothers disbanded, Parsons was scraping for money, living on the edge of ruin. Despite being one of the most innovative figures in American music, he never achieved major commercial success while alive. Then, in September 1973, at just 26 years old, Parsons overdosed on morphine and alcohol during a trip to Joshua Tree, California. His death was shocking, but what followed was even stranger. Friends, determined to honor his wish to be cremated in the desert, stole his body from the airport and set it ablaze in the sand. His estate, already riddled with debts, left little behind. What should have been a life of influence and fortune ended in bizarre tragedy. Together, the stories of Jim Reeves and Graham Parsons show two sides of the same brutal truth. Reeves was a polished star, adored worldwide yet left financially vulnerable by contracts and mismanagement. Parsons was a visionary rebel, born into wealth yet destroyed by addiction and chaos. One died in a plane crash, the other in a drug-fueled haze, both leaving behind music that would shape the future while their families and estates struggled in the present. They remind us that talent, whether wrapped in velvet or in cosmic rebellion, offers no guarantee of security when the music fades. Larry John Wilson was the kind of artist critics adored, but mainstream radio ignored. Born in Georgia in 1940, his deep baritone voice carried the weight of Southern soil, a blend of country, folk, and blues that was as authentic as the red clay fields he grew up on. His 1975 debut album, New Beginnings, was hailed by critics for its raw honesty, followed by a string of equally soulful records like Let Me Sing My Song to You and Loose Change. He appeared in the documentary Heart-Worn Highways, which later became a cult classic, placing him alongside the greatest singer-songwriters of his era. But Wilson's sound was too real, too unpolished for radio programmers chasing shiny Nashville hits. His albums sold modestly, and without radio play or label backing, his career stalled. By the early 1980s, he stepped away from music entirely, working as a truck driver, a tire salesman, and giving guitar lessons just to make ends meet. To those who met him, he seemed like an ordinary working man, not someone whose name had once been praised in Rolling Stone. In 1989, he attempted a comeback, touring small venues and reconnecting with fans who never forgot him, but the money never matched the respect. When he died of a stroke in 2010 at the age of 69, he left behind debts instead of assets. Another reminder that artistry alone does not secure a future. Hank Snow, by contrast, had climbed from poverty to the pinnacle of country stardom. Born in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1914, Snow endured a childhood scarred by abuse and hardship. He carried that pain into his songs, which often spoke of travel, freedom, and resilience. With classics like I'm Moving On, The Golden Rocket, and I've Been Everywhere, he became one of the most prolific and beloved artists in country music history, recording more than 140 albums and charting over 85 singles across a career that spanned 4 decades. At his height, Snow earned significant wealth and seemed to have escaped the poverty of his youth. But trust misplaced in managers and even family members cost him dearly. His own son, tasked with managing parts of his career, misappropriated funds, while dishonest promoters drained his accounts. Snow invested heavily in ranches, hoping to secure his future, but natural disasters wiped out much of his safety net. On stage, he remained a star, performing at the Grand Ole Opry well into his later years, but behind the curtain, his fortune dwindled away. By the time of his death in 1999, his financial worth had collapsed to little more than the value of a single tour bus. A shocking decline for a man who had once carried country music on his back. Tommy Collins, born Leonard Raymond Sipes in 1930, was another figure whose influence far outweighed his financial rewards. A pioneer of the Bakersfield sound, Collins penned classics like If You Ain't Lovin', You Ain't Livin', and Carolyn, songs that were made famous by other stars, including Farron Young and Merle Haggard. His early hits as a performer showed promise, but it was his songwriting that left the deepest mark on the genre. Yet despite his contributions, Collins lived a life of turmoil. He suffered from chronic depression, and in one infamous episode, abandoned his Cadillac on the highway and wandered into a field, disappearing for days. His erratic behavior, combined with poor financial management, left him vulnerable to mounting debts and IRS troubles. By the 1970s, much of his fortune was gone, even as others profited from his songs. Collins left the stage for a time, studying theology and even selling Bibles door to door just to survive. Though he continued writing, the royalties were modest, and promoters often overlooked his role in shaping country's sound. In his final years, dementia robbed him of his ability to perform or manage his affairs, leaving him in near total obscurity. When he died in 2000, he was virtually penniless. His legacy carried not by wealth, but by the voices of others who had turned his words into gold. Larry John Wilson, Hank Snow, and Tommy Collins each carved unique paths through country music, but all three met the same cruel ending: brilliance unmatched by financial reward. Their names fading from mainstream memory even as their music continued to influence generations. Their stories prove that in country music, talent is no guarantee of security, and even those who give everything to the craft can be left with nothing but debts, struggles, and a legacy the industry takes more than it ever returns. Johnny Horton was a star who seemed destined for a long career. With hits like The Battle of New Orleans, he brought history to life through song and earned a Grammy in 1960. But that same year, tragedy struck when a drunk driver killed him in a head-on collision at just 35. His widow Billie Jean, once married to Hank Williams, was left with debts and tangled publishing rights despite Horton's enduring fame. She took on odd jobs to survive, even as his songs kept playing nationwide. Billie Joe Spears faced hardship of a different kind, with bold songs like Mr. Walker, It's All Over, and Blanket on the Ground. She gave women in country music a new voice. Beloved especially in the UK, she enjoyed international tours, but the money never lasted. By the 1990s, she was playing small clubs for modest fees. A throat surgery cut into her career, and the collapse of her label ended her royalties. She died in 2011 at 73, remembered more for her strength than her bank account. Then there was Jimmy Capps, the quiet backbone of the Opry. For decades, his guitar supported country's biggest stars, yet his own name rarely appeared in the spotlight. He wrote and played songs that defined the sound of Nashville, but the pay was little compared to the legends he supported. By his later years, he struggled to pay bills, relying on friends and odd jobs. When he died, there were no grand headlines, only a quiet farewell for a man who gave everything to country music. Horton, Spears, and Capps remind us that fame is fragile. Horton's career was cut short. Spears battled financial struggles despite hits, and Capps gave his life to music, yet was forgotten in poverty. Together with the others, their lives form a painful truth. Country music may celebrate its stars on stage, but too often leaves them behind when the lights go out.